Welcome to the Value Stuff Podcast. I am your host, Dan Glazier, and I'm a personal property appraiser, and I value stuff for a living. Welcome to episode 2. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about different values when you are dealing with downsizing a household contents in a estate. I'm going to talk about 3 different values, but I'm going to focus mostly on one value. The 3 values that I'm going to be talking about are fair market value, liquidation value, and replacement value. So let's start off with fair market value. So the definition of fair market value, this is what I put in my appraisal reports. And when I'm doing fair market value, when I'm doing an appraisal report, it's primarily fair market values. When I'm doing reports for charitable donations, it's fair market values. When I'm doing a matrimonial appraisal, divorces, that is fair market value. So probably about 80 to 90% of my appraisals and appraisal reports, we're dealing with fair market values. Because usually that's what the courts want. That's usually what CRA wants. That's usually what the different levels of government want, is fair market value. So I'm going to read the definition of fair market value so we understand what fair market value is. So fair market value, the price at which the property would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither being under compulsion to sell and both having reasonable knowledge of relevant facts. So that's fair market value. So basically fair market value would be you have a good or an item, you have somebody selling it and they have a price, and you have a buyer and they're willing to pay that price. They're both happy and there's no sacrifices, and that's fair market value basically. Willing buyer, willing seller, both agree on a price. That's fair market value in just simple terms. And fair market value is that, again, that's when we're doing an appraisal report. Those are the fair market values. So let's just say I do appraisal report on whole household contents. The total fair market value, once you add everything up, let's say comes to $12,000. That's fair market value. The next value is called replacement value. And replacement value is primarily just for insurance. And it's really, that's what it's called. It's called a replacement value. So replacement value, I'll read what it says here and then I'll sort of explain it in more simple terms. Replacement value, the value of an asset as determined by the estimated cost of replacing it, how much it would cost you today to replace the item that was stolen or destroyed. So basically, if something was stolen or destroyed or lost and you had to replace it the same day or with a very short amount of time, and that's replacement cost. And replacement cost is always higher than fair market cost because you're always going to pay some kind of premium to replace the item. And that it could be the item you're replacing, it's gone up in value because of inflation or last supply issues. There could be many reasons, but replacement value is always higher than fair market value, and basically primarily insurance. So that's the best way to put it, just insurance, replacement value. So fair market value is what I deal with when that's the values without any kind of sacrifices. That's fair market value. The next value, the third value, which is the more difficult value, is liquidation value. And there are several layers to liquidation value. And I'm going to get into some of the specifics that I believe are the most relevant when you're talking about liquidation value. And let me read first before we get going. I'm going to read the definition of liquidation value as is in my report, which is a textbook of a liquidation value. So liquidation value, the price at which property would change hands when there's a financial situation or other limiting circumstances existing at the time of sale so as to require a sacrifice. So to me, the most important word in there is sacrifice. So it's financial and sacrifice. So financial situation causes sacrifice. In about probably 90+% of the time, when we have to sell the contents of a household, especially if we're dealing with an estate, there's usually some form of sacrifice, which becomes a financial So I'm going to explain. These are my 2 biggest ones, and how can I explain this? Okay. The number one issue when we're talking about liquidation value is time. And there's many levels to time also. So I do an appraisal report for a household. And again, let's say the whole household, fair market value, not liquidation value, fair market value, that means no sacrifices at all, would come to $15,000. So we're saying, so everything in the house is $15,000. This is a hypothetical number anyway, so I'm just using it because it's a simple number, 15,000. And then people will always say to me, okay, we're going to sell all the items. Dan, what's the best way to sell it? And, depending on different circumstances, I can make some recommendations. But time, the first question I ask, how much time do you have? If the house is already sold and there's a closing date, then we have a very hard line. Let's say that's 30 days. So you have 30 days to get rid of everything. So definitely that's, it can be done in 30 days. Would you like more time? Definitely. A couple of months would be better, but 30 days. Everything can be sold in 30 days, but definitely there's a timeline, so we're dealing with 30 days. And then there's a hard line of 30 days, but there's also the person in charge of downsizing all the stuff in the household. How much time do they have? So there's also time of how much time do you have to get rid of everything in the household, or sell, donate, whatever you need to do, recycle, get rid of, doesn't matter. How much time do you have? And how much time as the point person do you have? That's, to me, is the most important thing, because most people have jobs. Most people have other commitments. They have kids, they have grandkids, they have soccer practice, baseball practice, hockey practice, homework, tutors, a job, and you can only put so much time towards this. So even though if you're an executor, in most cases you can get compensated for your time with dealing with the estate, most of us in our jobs can't take a month off to deal with all the items. So that's another question. How much time do you have? So there's two levels. There's the time of, okay, I have 1 month to get rid of everything in this household. But the other is, I only have 4 or 5 days out of that month to deal with it. So that's a sacrifice with time. And also, when you're dealing with time, you might not have very much time. It might require more time than you have, which means you might have to hire somebody to sell these items or deal with these items. So there's another level of time where it's financial. So liquidation, basically, the best way to put it, you would take your fair market value, and the cost of selling these items is your liquidation value. So that would be time. So time will cost, whether it's your time, whether it's the time of having to hire someone to pay for their time. And if you're hiring professional organizers or downsizers, usually they're between $50 to $100. Just that's in this market that I'm in, the Greater Toronto market. It might be more money if you're in a different market. It might be less money, but that's per person. So $50 to $100. It just to give you an idea. So let's use that number, 15,000, and then we would have the cost that to get rid of those items. So that's the time, whether it's your time, whether it's how much time you have, that's time. Time is definitely a big factor in liquidation value. Let me give you an example of time. So I did an appraisal a few years ago in a very nice neighborhood in Toronto, and it was a house, and at this point there wasn't any time restrictions. The gentleman had said it was an estate and he just needed to know the fair market values. He needed them more he wanted to make decisions on how we should sell the items, what prices to sell the items for, where to sell the items. And he just overall wanted to know the value so he could make a decision. He wasn't pressured for time. So that was fine. So I said, yeah, I'll do an appraisal report. I did for the whole content. So I came over and I inventoried everything, took photographs of everything, went back. I told him it would take about probably about a week, and that's what it took roughly. So I did my research and I did a nice appraisal report for him. I emailed him to let him know the report was completed, and he hadn't received the report yet. And then he emailed me back and said, "Can you call me?" So I called him. He said, "Things have changed. The house sold and we have a 2-week closing. And if you could help me get rid of all the items." So all of a sudden, it wasn't months and months and months, which he thought. He now had a couple of weeks to deal with all the items. I said I could help him, but I was also going on vacation, and this was sort of the end of COVID. When we first just opened up, I wasn't going to cancel my vacation, but I did know someone that could help him out. So I contacted her. She was able to put together, do an online auction. Everything was sold within that 2 weeks. It was all taken care of, but it came at a cost. And that was the cost. There was her cost as a professional organizer and downsizer, and her staff. And then she also had to deal with stuff that wasn't marketable. So there was garbage bins, there was taking stuff to donation and stuff. So let's just say the fair market value of everything was $15,000. The liquidation value was minus the professional organizer to deal with all the items and her staff, garbage bins, all that stuff to deal with what didn't sell and what was not saleable and marketable, things, the time to take stuff to donation. And then there's also there was an auction, and there was a cost of the auction, and she used a platform called Max Sold, and at that time they were about 30%. So it was 30% minus. So the liquidation value there was probably about 50% of the fair market value. So I don't remember the exact number, but let's just say the value was 15,000, and then the cost to sell the items. So there was required a sacrifice, which means it was a financial situation. So fair market value was 15,000. Liquidation value was about 7,500 roughly. It was it cost roughly 50% to sell the items. When you talk about time also, this is where sacrifices come in. There was quite a few musical instruments there that had you had more time, or had he had more time, could have sold for probably likely a lot more as individual sales. He probably would have got close to fair market value, but unfortunately he didn't have the time to do that. He had 2 weeks, and that's what happened. So that's liquidation value. I hope I explained that and wasn't too complicated. It's a story about liquidation value. So liquidation, time is also definitely a factor for liquidation value. Another big factor when you're talking about liquidation value is location. And what do I mean by location? Location, again, there's several levels to location. Location is, are you in a urban area like Toronto, New York, or big metropolitan area where you have basically millions of buyers within a half an hour radius of you? Or are you in a rural area? And what I mean by rural area, I guess, let's give a definition so it makes sense. You would be in an area where there's less than 100,000 potential buyers within a half an hour radius of you. So you're kind of in the country. That would be the best way. Whether it's a farming community, whether it's a cottage community, it's just you're not near a big city. You're at least an hour or so from a larger town, larger city, say. So that would be rural. That's the definition of location. Are you in a rural area? Or are you in an urban area? Another thing about location is you could be in an urban area. You could be in a big city like Toronto. But if you're in a house, not in a house, if you're in a house, makes things much easier. But if you're in a condo or you're in an apartment, you might not be able to sell the items from your location. And that adds another financial layer. And what I mean by that is if you can't sell from the condo, say, you might have to hire movers, move the items to a storage locker or a storage facility, and you might have to sell them from there. So there's definitely a cost there. That's so you take your fair market value of everything, and then that's a cost there, which would be part of your liquidation value, financial sacrifice. If this could also be a factor if you're in an urban area, people might not be willing to come to your location to buy your stuff. So you might have to load up, you might have to hire movers to move it, into an area where there's just more buyers and more than 100,000 plus potential buyers. Let's say we're just using that as a sort of a guideline. It also depends on the items that you have, but people generally, if they can buy similar items, within a half an hour drive, they're not going to drive 2 hours unless you have spectacular items and stuff like that. But that's location is very important when it comes to your liquidation value and what the cost would be there. I'm going to tell you a story about an appraisal I did a couple of years ago, and this is relevant to location. I got a phone call, and a lady had called and says, I'd like a fair market appraisal of all my stuff. I live on an island. I have a cottage, and I live on an island, and there's a lot of really good stuff. It's a fairly large cottage, and my husband and I spent several years traveling around Ontario and northern Quebec and all through the Maritimes and northeast part of the United States. And we collected, furniture and different items and folk items. And, we filled our cottage with them. And I just want to get a fair market value because I'm thinking of selling my cottage. I have several children. If they want some of the items, I want to be fair to them. If the person that buys my cottage, maybe they want, all the contents or part of the contents. So I just need to know the fair market value so I can make a proper decision. So I said, sure, I can definitely provide a fair market value for that. So I drove up there. It was in Northern Ontario. I drove up there. She picked me up at a marina, very elegant lady, and picked me up in a boat. She drove it herself, which was very cool. We went to her island. So it wasn't just a cottage on an island. She owned the island. And there wasn't one cottage. There was 5 cottages. And it was spectacular. That's the best way to put it. It was one of my favorite appraisals I ever did. And I realized I was going to be there all day, which was fine. So I spent the whole day inventorying each cottage and all the contents of the cottage and taking pictures. And then after I was done, I went back to the main cottage, which was hers, which is really like a big lodge. And we sat down in the kitchen, this beautiful antique French table. And she asked me, she said, when you're done with your appraisal and I have all the values, when the time comes, if the new buyers don't want the majority of the stuff, and she said, I'm not going to take a lot of the stuff. I just won't have room where I'm going. And I suspect my children won't want that much of the stuff. Would you be willing to manage the sale of all the items? And I said, definitely, but I have to think about this. I definitely have to think about this. And I will get back to you. So driving back to Toronto, I was like, okay, she's on an island and there's 5 cottages. We can't put everything in a couple of boats. So here are the liquidation costs and the sacrifices. We would have to move, we'd have to rent a barge probably for 2 days. I would have to probably hire 4 movers for 2 days. We would have to then, we're in a rural area, so the closest sort of urban area with a substantial amount of customers, because we want a lot of customers, because there was some pretty awesome items there, would probably be about 2 hours away. The closest sort of small city was about 2 hours away. So we'd have to probably rent warehouse space probably 2 months. So here's the liquidation costs that deal with location: renting a barge, um, movers, probably 4 movers for 2 days, moving truck and moving the items 2 hours away, a warehouse for a couple of days, or a warehouse probably 60 days, because there was a substantial amount of items. I don't think 30 days probably wouldn't have been enough. Probably 60 days to properly market it and sell it, and then my cost. So quite a bit. It was worth it in this case because the substantial amount of value there. But again, by the time, if you factored everything in, and another cost too is when you sold everything, which probably would have gone through some kind of auction, whether online auction or live auction or something. We're probably, looking between, probably 20 to 30% there. So if you factored in all the costs, again, we were probably at 50 or 60%. So liquidation value, because of location, would have probably been about 50 to 60% of what the fair market value of the items. So I'm just trying to give an example to understand what liquidation value is. So basically, liquidation value is you take your fair market value, let's use that as gross, and then we would minus the sacrifices, the financial sacrifices. In that case, there was no time because it hadn't sold. I didn't end up dealing with all that, I was happy and sad at the same time, just because the stuff was spectacular, but it was a big project. Yes, I could have managed it. One of the reasons I could manage it is I grew up with an uncle who had a couple of cottages on an island, so I completely understood how you move things from land to water, and renting barges or renting large boats or platform boats. I understood all the logistics of it. Doesn't mean it was easy, but that I just wanted to give a good example of, that's an extreme example of location. It's no different that if you're in a very rural area, if you have to have enough items to make it worthwhile to move them. You might also decide liquidation value. The liquidation value might be, like, say the whole household contents isn't 15,000 or 20,000 or 50,000. Maybe it's 5,000, and the liquidation costs might be that much money. So your liquidation costs might be more than what you could sell the items for. In that case, you might end up having to donate the items. Hopefully we don't throw the items out or put them in a garbage bin, but you have to really understand that liquidation value is time and location. That's the most important thing. Another factor I want to talk about is the actual type of items. So when you have a whole household contents, I'm talking macro about all this stuff, a whole household contents, but you might have some high ticket items. You might be in a rural area or a condo or apartment, but the smaller items that have more value, and these are the items I'm talking about. I'm talking about possibly a coin collection, jewelry, sterling silver flatware, things that are easily moved that one person can move. There could be some really good artwork that is you could move yourself, or you might have to hire movers, but it's fairly inexpensive because they're not large pieces, and they're wanted items of some of the major auction companies. Those you can move relatively, and the liquidation of those is not going to be 50, 60, 70%. The liquidation value of those items might be 10, 20, 30%, depending on the items and what the cost is to sell them. There's always a cost to usually sell items, and that'll be your liquidation value. So when I talk macro, I'm talking about like the whole household contents, and you sort of sell it in one swoop, but it can also be multi-level. Yes, as a percentage, and you factor everything in, it might be, the liquidation value might be 40, 50, 60% of the whole household contents, but there are some contents in there that might be, 70, 80, 90%. I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to be as clear as possible, but it's it's very complicated when you're dealing with liquidation value. Fair market value is very simple: willing buyer, willing seller, no sacrifices. Replacement value, you're just dealing with what the cost would be to replace it. But when you're dealing with liquidation value, and that's what you're primarily dealing with when you're downsizing a whole household contents in a state, that's the onion. I'll talk about more in my next podcast about different ways of selling it. And that's where I'll explain a little more about the high ticket items you would take to maybe this auction company, and maybe the remaining 90%, 80%, 70% you might sell as an online auction. But I'll talk about it in more detail. So that's liquidation value. And that's primarily what this podcast is about today, is liquidation value. So 3 values: fair market value, pretty simple, willing buyer, willing seller. Replacement value, basically it's just we're dealing with insurance values. Liquidation value is the one that's more complicated. It basically means there's some kind of financial sacrifice. It's a case by case scenario, depending on how much time you have, how much time you want to spend on it, your location. Are you located in a rural area? You might not be in a rural area, but you're in an apartment or you're in a condo, and they won't allow you to sell the stuff out of there. So there's another level where you're going to actually have to move this stuff. So that's liquidation value. I hope it's kind of long-winded in talking but it is very complicated about liquidation value. But I hope this helps. I'm going to leave my in the description. I forgot to do it in my last podcast. I'm going to have my email contact and my website. So if you have any questions, you can contact me. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Dan Glazier, the Value of Stuff podcast. Please subscribe and share this podcast so we can grow it. We're on all the major podcast hosts. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. Dan Glazier. Thank you.